The Girl on the Corner. I'll break it down into sections for easier expansion. The Girl on the Corner. Part 1. The Encounter. On the busy corner of 7th Avenue, a little black girl, no more than 10, sat on the cracked sidewalk, her knees drawn to her chest. Her eyes scanned the street for kindness, though little of it ever came. The city moved too fast. People passed by without a glance, their hurried footsteps echoing a collective indifference. She was just part of the scenery, an afterthought in the mosaic of the bustling urban world. Her name was Tara, but no one ever asked. Her small cardboard sign, scrawled in shaky letters, read, "Please help, hungry." Her clothes were tattered, her hair braided in neat rows but frizzy at the edges, the result of weeks without proper care. Every so often, a few coins would clatter into the small paper cup in front of her. Sometimes $1, maybe two, but never enough. One day, as the evening sun began to cast long shadows over the street, an old man noticed her. Mr. Samuel Dixon was in his 70s, his gait slow but deliberate, his eyes sharp behind a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a gray woolen coat that had seen better days. His shoes shined but old, his hat slightly tilted. He wasn't wealthy by any means, just a retired teacher, living on a modest pension in a rent-controlled apartment nearby. He paused, his brow furrowed. Something about Tara caught his attention. She wasn't like the others he'd seen on the street over the years, those lost to addiction or despair. There was a quiet strength in her, an air of determination beneath the weariness. He approached, his shadow falling over her. "Hello there," he said gently, kneeling down beside her. "What's your name, young lady?" Tara glanced up, surprised. People didn't usually stop to talk. They either threw money at her or ignored her altogether. She hesitated for a moment, then whispered, "Tara? How long have you been out here, Tara?" "Couple weeks," she muttered, looking down at her shoes. "Just trying to get by." Samuel's heart ached. He had been a teacher for over 40 years, watching children grow up, teaching them about the world. But here was a child who had fallen through the cracks. He couldn't just walk away. "Are you hungry?" he asked. She nodded, her eyes still wary. "Come on," he said, standing up and extending his hand. "Let's get you something to eat." Tara hesitated, unsure if she could trust him. But something about the old man felt safe. She took his hand, and together they walked down the street, disappearing into the crowd. Part 2. A Meal and a Story. Mr. Dixon led Tara to a small diner a few blocks away, the kind where the waitresses still called you honey and knew the regulars by name. They slid into a booth by the window, and Samuel ordered a couple of burgers, fries, and milkshakes. As they waited for the food, he tried to learn more about her. "Where are your parents, Tara?" he asked softly. Tara shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Ma'am, she died. Last year. I've been on my own since." She avoided his eyes, instead staring out the window. Samuel felt a lump in his throat. "And your father? Don't know him. Never met him." She shrugged, trying to sound indifferent, but the pain was evident in her voice. The food arrived, and Tara attacked it like she hadn't eaten in days. Samuel let her eat in silence for a while before speaking again. "Do you have anywhere to stay?" Tara shook her head, still chewing. "Sometimes I sleep at the shelter, but it's always full. Mostly I sleep on the streets." Samuel sat back in his seat, staring at her. This was a child barely surviving in a world that had already been too cruel to her. He knew he couldn't fix everything, but maybe he could help her find some stability. "Listen, Tara," he said, his voice serious. "I don't have much, but I know some people. There's a woman I used to work with, Mrs. Evans. She runs a program for kids like you to get them off the streets and into school. I could introduce you to her." Tara looked at him skeptically. "Why you me?" Samuel smiled sadly. "Because I've seen too many kids like you fall through the cracks. And I promised myself, Whenever I could, I'd help. She nodded, though her eyes were still cautious. Trust wasn't something easily earned on the streets. Part 3. Finding Hope. The next day, Samuel took Tara to meet Mrs. Evans, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile and a fierce determination to help at-risk youth. The program provided shelter food and education for homeless children, helping them get back on their feet. Tara was hesitant at first, unsure if she wanted to be part of something that required trust and commitment. But Samuel stayed by her side, encouraging her to give it a try. Mrs. Evans took an immediate liking to Tara, recognizing the resilience in her that Samuel had seen. Over the next few weeks, Tara slowly began to open up, both to Mrs. Evans and to the other kids in the program. She started attending school again, something she hadn't done in almost a year. It wasn't easy. Her trust in adults had been shattered long ago, and she carried the weight of her mother's death with her every day. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Samuel visited her often, bringing her books and sitting with her in the small library at the shelter. They would talk for hours about history, literature, and life. Tara learned that Samuel had been a history teacher for nearly half a century, and his passion for knowledge was infectious. He told her stories about the civil rights movement, about great black leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Harriet Tubman. He told her about his own struggles growing up as a black man in the South, and how he had overcome adversity to become a teacher. Tara soaked up everything he said. She had always been smart, but life had taken her off course. Now, with Samuel's guidance, she began to dream again. Dream about a future where she wasn't just surviving, but thriving. Part 4. Trials and Triumphs. Not everything was smooth sailing. Tara had moments of doubt where the pull of the streets felt stronger than the walls of the shelter. There were nights when the trauma of her past overwhelmed her, and she would sneak out, wandering the darkened streets, lost in her grief. But Samuel always found her. He would sit with her on a bench or the curb, never scolding, just listening. And when she was ready, he'd walk her back to the shelter. One particularly cold night after a hard day at school, where some of the kids had teased her for being the homeless girl, Tara broke down. She sat on the sidewalk outside the shelter, her knees pulled to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Samuel found her there, as he often did. "I don't belong here," she sobbed. "I don't belong anywhere." Samuel knelt beside her, his old bones creaking with the effort. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You belong right here, Tara. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." "But they don't understand," she cried. "They don't know what it's like to be like me." Samuel's heart ached for her. He had seen so many kids like Tara, kids who felt invisible, unwanted. But he also knew her strength. "You're right," he said softly. "They don't know. But that doesn't mean you can't show them. You're stronger than you think, Tara. You've already survived more than most people ever will, and you're still here. That's something." Tara wiped her eyes, her breathing slowing as his words sank in. She didn't respond, but she leaned into his side, letting him hold her as they sat in silence. Part 5. A new beginning. Months passed, and Tara continued to grow. She excelled in school, thanks in part to Samuel's tutoring, and began to make friends within the program. Mrs. Evans became a mentor to her, helping her navigate the emotional challenges of her past. Slowly but surely, Tara began to heal. One day, as they sat together in the library, Samuel handed Tara a worn-out book. "This was my favorite book when I was your age," he said with a smile. "I think you'll like it." Tara took the book, running her fingers over the faded cover. It was a collection of stories about historical black figures, people who had fought for justice, for equality, for a better world. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. Samuel smiled, his heart full. "You're going to do great things, Tara. I can feel it. And for the first time in a long time, Tara believed him. Epilogue. The legacy continues. Years later, Tara stood at the front of a classroom, her students hanging on her every word as she told them the stories of Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, and Martin Luther King Jr. She